Hello again. It's me. So last month I did a library haul. Or was it just a general? I think it was mostly library haul, but then some ebooks I got too. This is just gonna be a recap of what I read last month because I am going full force in the re-immersion into like regular readership as opposed to, oh, I'm reading this for a meme or I'm reading this for a movie, because that's essentially why I'm reading the Percy Jackson and related universe. I finished all the Percy Jackson books. Now I'm in the Heroes of Olympics books. That's why I finished. That's why I started reading those books. Actually, not because of the movie, which the two I'd seen, not because of all the Tumblr posts, but because of a compilation of um, TikToks and Vines, like those videos. It's just like Percy Jackson as Vines, Percy Jackson as or whatever as Vines, or whatever as TikToks, or whatever as whatever. So that's why I started reading Percy Jackson. So I'm not, I'm trying to get back into being a. I'm trying to rather really be a reader who reads for pleasure. So I'm doing these videos. I'm doing these videos um, to kind of hold myself accountable in a way. Um, so they won't be that often. I don't know that I'm going to read it often. Last month I read a lot of books because I had just joined NetGalley and I got a bunch. So I was trying to read as many as I could. I still have a bunch, but a couple of them don't come out till next year, so there's not super crazy pressure to read them right now. There's only a couple that I have left that either came out already this year or are coming out sometime this month. Um, so those are a couple I have to get through. But this is just what I read last month, and these are the names of the books. I think this is also in order of when I read them. In the month of October, I'm not counting the ones that I read at the end of September. I'm not counting the ones that I'm still reading and almost done with. These are just the ones I finished in the month of October. I think probably most of these yeah, I think also almost all of these I also started in October as well. So, books I started and finished in October. Number one, Animus by Antoine Revoy. Then I had Pivot, L.C. Barlow. Mr. Mercedes, Stephen King. That's the first of a trilogy, which I'll probably end up start reading, but I'll continue on with that later. Then there was Athena's Choice, Adam Boostrom. Wild About Weeds, Jack Wallington. Stolen Words, Melanie Florence. York the Shadow Cipher, Laura Ruby. Smoke by Dan Villetta. And Final Girls by Riley Sager. That is a total, should be, of 9. of 9 books. But anyway, let me recap what I read. And I'm going to have a link in the description to my blog and probably the respective posts about each of these books. So let me start with the book that I gave the lowest rating to. That was Final Girls by Riley Sager. I ended up giving that a 2 stars. 2 star rating. It was, it was for what it was. I don't think ever in my mind it was ever probably going to reach like a 4 star book. It was probably going to hover at most like around a 3 star book because it was, the plot didn't even seem that crazy. Like, where was the plot going to go? So essentially, and these are going to have spoilers. So essentially, what happens in Final Girls is a bunch of these girls who are dubbed Final Girls by the media because they've each survived this massacre or this tragedy, and they're the sole survivor. And it deals with the main character who, um, she's, I mean, fine, you've been through this trauma, but she's like kind of hella entitled, and her actions are just really wild the whole thing throughout. Like, I can't. It wasn't. There wasn't really any tension throughout the book. There wasn't any type of, oh wow, that came out of left field. I never would have imagined that to be the plot twist. There was none of that. Nothing, no new developments were made, no new discoveries were made. It wasn't a crazy, fantastic read. It was okay, but the reason why I ended up giving it 2 stars, at the end, there was a twist. And the twist wasn't a twist. There was no real build up to really cement that, oh, I have this loss from this twist, this emotional loss. That the journey I've read through has been this emotional loss. It really wasn't even this twist that reflected well on the character. It was just like throwing something in there for shock value, and it wasn't even that shocking. So the thing is that I go back and forth between NetGalley and Goodreads ratings. The NetGalley rating is kind of like, would you recommend this? If it's a maybe, you get like a 3. And then it goes up from there. And respectively down to a 1. The Goodreads rating is, did you like it? Was it was okay. It was good. I really liked it. This is great and amazing. 2, 3, 4, and 5 essentially. This was okay. I didn't really like this book. I don't think I ever have caught, like, I'm not like, oh my gosh, I'm so intrigued into the story, and if this was made into like a series, I'm so enraptured in the story. No, it was okay. It was an okay read. It wasn't anything crazy. It wasn't a solid story that had a bunch of problems. It was just okay. And that's those are my thoughts on the book. It's a quick enough read. There wasn't necessarily a lot of tension. The plot was the story set up, the idea of it, the concept was interesting enough that I picked it up and borrowed it. The cover art was lovely, but the execution, I couldn't relate to the character. She was quite annoying, very entitled, and it was essentially just about, oh, I had this trauma, so look at all the entitled ways in which I deal with my trauma and face no consequences. So no, I didn't care for this character at all, and I mean, it was okay. And I have a bunch of 3-star books, and I'll go from probably like my least favorite of those books to, not even necessarily my least favorite, but yeah, I'll go from my least favorite of the books to my favorite of the books. The next book I read on the rating scale was Athena's Choice by Adam Boostrom. And the concept, the idea of put forth by the story was really interesting. It's 2099, I think it is. And there's no more men on Earth. There was a virus, killed off all the men, and now there's only women existing. But there's a project underway to bring back the men because it was some virus that affected the G code, and somehow, you know, made it so that there's no men. However that works, all over the place. The virus started in this geographical area. Maybe it was launched, but it's affected the whole world on such a devastating scale in just 2099. That's a lot of technological process that would have to be made because 2099 is 50 years already without men. So that means 2044. That means 30 years from now, technology has advanced that far to develop a virus to eliminate all the men, all of them. No resistant strains, nobody. All the men are dead. Right. So essentially, women are living in this utopia, and you have this half portion of women who are like, we don't want the men back. We're doing fine without them. We're living in a utopia where everyone's equal. There's no disease. There's barely any, illness and deaths outside of other stuff. Why we don't want the men? They were terrible. They were the root cause for everything bad. We don't want the men. And then you have the opposite part of that, which is like, but you know what? Not everyone is okay being in female-female relationships. Not everyone is okay having our brothers just killed and not having brothers again. Not everyone is okay not having sons. Everyone is okay not having husbands, which is a valid argument. Um, but also kind of wild because you're so desperate for men to come back, but you're in this utopia, this egalitarian utopia. Somehow, in the future, you're in this egalitarian utopia, and if we take that, everyone's, you're really not okay without having the men. Okay, I get it. Let's move past that point. There were just the way the resolution of the story came about, and the justifications for it were wild. Were really, really wild. And I had a lot of problems because logically, you can tell that this was a book written by a man, which it was, but it showed, and not in logical ways. You know, I gave it a 3 stars. There were problems with execution. There was a problem with story logic, but it was really well written. I thought, for majority of it, it could have been longer probably, but it was an interesting concept, and it was a fine read. It's fine enough. I gave it 3 stars. You know, would I recommend this to somebody if somebody's asking me specifically, like, oh, do you know a good sci-fi book or something that deals with something along these lines? Then I'd probably be like, oh, I read this book. You might or may not like it because what I give 3 stars might be someone else's 5-star book. So, the next book was Pivot by Elsie Barlow, and this is another book that I think it's meant to be the beginning of a series. I don't know when the next book in the series is going to come out, but Pivot essentially is it's like a big morality tale, but also like fantasy, because and I don't want to give too much away because I feel like people won't want to read this. It's essentially cults and child assassins. And then maybe angels? I feel like that's a good enough summary of that book without giving too much away. It was solid. It was solid. And a lot of the ebooks I read, a lot of the fiction ebooks I read, off of NetGalley have been short in respect to what they should be, I feel. So I think like this is half one of those books. Also there was just things, and then ended up moving fast towards the end. And some of the things felt forced, like there felt a bit of forced romance and whatnot. But I gave it a 3 stars. If there's, I'll probably end up reading the sequel. I feel like the sequel would probably be somewhat interesting, and depending on how they build the world. But the 3 stars, I had problems with the pacing of the story. But also there was, the tropes. I mean, that's always a thing. So, it's 3 stars for me, but I'll probably, keep on with the series whenever it comes out next. The 4th book I read was Smoke by Dan Villetta, and this was one that had been on my Overdrive wish list. We have it's a kind of like an alternative fantasy type because it's an alternate London where people produce this smoke. I guess it kind of oozes out of their like skin, with respect to how much they're sinning, or supposedly how much they're sinning, and the idea is that the elite in society, the socially elite, the rich people don't smoke at all because they're innately better, which is obviously not the case, and is what the protagonists learn throughout the story. And then it's just hijinks around, not even hijinks, like, adventure around that. And they kind of, in the book flap, it's kind of like implied that, because you have the 2 protagonists who go to this all-boys school, and it's kind of implied that at their all-boys school, there's these 3 teachers who work for different factions, which is not a false statement, it's just not really ever strongly presented in the book. Like, it's, you learn at points, but it's not ever like, oh my gosh, a plot point, and this person is plot. It's not strongly presented. And then, again, forced relationships, rushed pacing at the end. There's a sequel coming out next year, Soot is coming out next year. And I'd be interested to see if that has a better resolution, because it wasn't written poorly. It was written quite nicely, actually, quite well. Um, but again, pacing at the end was a big issue. The resolution was vague and rushed. Um, the rationale for the resolution uh, was vague and rushed. Um, it just and a lot of things didn't make sense. A lot of privileged logic this just didn't make sense. So another book that I gave 3 stars that I'll probably read the sequel to, but not something that wow really stayed with me. Wow, but it was a solid read. Yeah, and again, if someone had asked me would I recommend it, again they probably have to be asking along the lines of like what are you looking for? Oh, I want an alternative fantasy type book. Then yeah, I might mention this book, but it's not a book that I'm necessarily gonna say, oh, I read this awesome book, you have to read it. But if you're looking for something along that lines, this might be something to consider.
So, a book I forgot to give my thoughts for when I was recording was Animus by Antoine Revoy. This book was a cute little graphic novel that I picked up very casually at the library. It's essentially about this haunted playground in Japan. These 2 young protagonists and how they, I guess, deal or try to undo the haunting, and how it relates to current events in their lives. The reading was very simple, very easy to do. It was totally in English. Not for a quick turnaround and the pacing at the end and just like a bland story ending, this might have gotten 5. Though that probably would have been a stretch. It would have had to been probably like a lot longer, a lot more fleshed out to get 5 stars. But it was really short all of a sudden, and then it just randomly, just cut off. So that's why I ended up giving like a 4 star. It wasn't like middle of the road. Maybe it was a fast enough read. It was cute, simple. So I gave it a 4 stars.
Next book I read was Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King, and I think it came out on like some AT&T webpage or something a couple of years ago. The TV series, and I think I watched like the first 2 episodes with my mother, and apparently she remembered more of the TV show than I did because I did not. I remembered the opening scene, and I remembered some scene in the protagonist's home. Um, but she had apparently remembered more than I did. It's a crime thriller, and the protagonist is chasing down a mass murderer who randomly contacts him out of the blue, trying to get him to kill himself, or trying to egg him on to kill himself. The protagonist is a retired cop, and a bunch of things could have been done. He could have followed protocol. He could have done a bunch of stuff, but instead, he decides to do it like a semi one man show, solve it himself and his little mock team, because that's what the story needed to progress. The story was interesting. My biggest issue with this book was we go back and forth between who's telling the story. We go back and forth between different characters. Whenever we were in the character, the murderer's voice, whenever we were reading from his perspective, we just had to deal with his racist thoughts. So there was a lot of like random slurs being thrown around, and it's like, okay, I get it. Like, he's racist. I get it. He's a terrible person. But I don't need to be reading and just like, oh, N-word, N-word, other slurs, other slurs. Ha ha ha. I don't need to get it to get that he's a murderer. It wasn't really necessary. Stephen King has written a lot of books about subversive New England racism, or rather, not about, but where it's a large part of the story. But it was just a lot, and it was unnecessary. And then also, you have a black character, Jerome, and it's just like, a lot of the things he was doing, it's like, no one would do this. Who is doing this? I cannot see a black male doing this ever, especially not in the year 20, I think it was 2016 in the book or something. No one is doing this. So that was the biggest issue. I had with this book. And if I could put it between a 3 and a 4, I probably would have put some score between a 3 and a 4, because it was a big enough thing that I was like, do I give this a 3 or do I give this a 4? I ended up giving it a 4, but I feel like 4, really downplays how bad how bad that was, how much of a detriment that was to my reading of this book. Mm. So I ended up giving that a 4 stars, but realistically, it's probably like between a 3 and a 4, not like a solid 4. But I'll probably read the second book. I don't know where and when the show picks up. If the show was just, I think the show is like its third season. I don't know if each season is correlating to one of the books because it's a trilogy. Um, so I don't know. I think what I want to do is finish the trilogy and then watch. I really don't know what the other two books are about, but I gave this a 4, and this is like middle of the pack of my 9 book. This is one of the better books of the 9 I read, but I still had my issues with it. The next book I read was a nonfiction book, I guess. I don't really know what you call instructional type type books. Instructional type books. That was Wild About Weeds by Jack Wallington. It was really interesting. I am a plant person. I have a couple videos on my channel about plants. I'm a plant person, so I love learning more about plants and what people do with plants and how plants can be used and how they can serve different functions in the ecosystem, etc., etc. This book was really interesting because it's all about purposeful designing with weeds. There are a couple of books out there in the ether. There are a couple of books about not considering weeds as they are considered weeds. Weeds, because plants are plants, and plants all serve ecological purposes even when they're invasive or weedy, right? But this book was really interesting because it was about purposeful design with plants that are otherwise considered weeds. There's almost like slight issues I have with the book. It's not necessarily geared towards the everyday home consumer, the everyday amateur decorator. I think the author is like a landscape designer. All the plants he was referencing were all done in Latin names. Supposed to use this plant and referencing it by its common name, or one of its common names. It was, let me reference it by its Latin name, which is great because Latin names are more universal across the board than common names. Common names differ by countries, which is great. But if I'm reading the book and I don't know all of these these plants by Latin name, which was the case, a lot of plants I did not know, I had to look up on Google, which detracted from my reading. On top of which, then a lot of times it was, mention a plant, and then in parentheses it would say go to page whatever. So I was reading this in ebook, which was, I'm not gonna be skimming through the ebook because the ebook e-reader, the Adobe digital editions, is hard enough to go through. It stalls a lot. So having to go back and forth between the e-reader is not super simple. Maybe a physical copy would be better, but even then it wasn't like go references in that page. It was more like everything was broken up by would-be conditions, like, weeds for shade, weeds for ground cover, weeds for sun, which was a great thing in itself because it's like, I didn't know this about this plant, and whatever. But also it made weird the idea that you have to be flipping back and forth constantly throughout. It's a kind of like a halting read. But those were really the only issues I had with the book. I feel like I learned a lot. If I had a copy of the book, I would really love it. But it was really interesting. So yeah, that I gave that a 4 stars, not a 5 stars, but a 4 stars. And I feel pretty confident about that rating. Yeah. The next book I read was Stolen Words by Melanie Florence. And Stolen Words is I think it was like 30 something pages, all in all, and at least the ebook was, because again I read it in an ebook. Stolen Words was about this granddaughter who's asking her grandfather about the Cree language one day, and he's like, essentially, I don't remember a lot of words because of forced relocation and forced language attrition, and she's all sad when she sees that he's sad. And then the next day she comes back with a book she got from her school, and it's like, oh, it's Intro to Cree, Grandpa, will you teach me? And he's all happy because it's like, oh, one, a chance to reconnect with my language, and two, oh, I get to share this with my granddaughter. And it's a very cute story. It's a very touching story in that way. It's nice because each page had the story dialogue in Cree and in English. So if you're, someone who was saying, "Oh, I want to learn the Cree language," you could go back and use the book for like a reference point to like see what is what. You had some like at the end of the book, you had a reference point of what I think it was like 6 words that they highlighted and what they meant. It's a nice like stepping point if you're trying to get someone to learn like presumably like a young child because it's a children's book to learn or get interested in the Cree language. So this was really sweet, and I appreciated it, and I appreciate what it stands for. I enjoyed it. It was a 5-star book, but it did feel a bit short. I guess it could have been longer, or more words maybe could have been introduced, but it was, I think, very appropriate for what it was. And it was one of the better books I read in the month of October, even though it was like a picture book. That was like 32 pages, I think. Or at least the ebook was 32 pages or something. So yeah, this was a good read. If you're someone who's trying to get a child to show interest in a language, and I guess in this case, the Cree language, this would probably be a nice little starter point. Maybe they would start asking questions, and you could start a conversation. Yeah, yeah. I think obviously the most touching thing of it was the grandfather and his story. That was probably the intention. But the illustrations were lovely as well, um, and the portrayal of what was obviously a very painful topic for the grandfather and a painful ordeal to go through. Through the illustrations was lovely. Um, deeper story. So that was interesting, and it would be a good starting point to either learn more about forced relocations. I think this is mostly around those type of events in Canada, maybe. Um, but yeah, it was a good children's book. I think. Yeah, it's pretty good. So that's 8 books out of 9. And my last book was the second book I gave 5 stars to because I really enjoyed it. And this is a book that I feel like a lot of people should read. And I probably end up recommending a lot to people. Um, it was York the Shadow Cipher by Laura Ruby. And this book was not a book I intended to get. It's not a book that was on any wish list of mine. I was at the library. I was borrowing A Darker Shade of Magic and Final Girls, I think I borrowed at the same time as this book, as York the Shadow Cipher. And it wasn't something I intended to get. I was by the checkout. Checkout. Is that what you call it? The library? The checkout at the library. And I looked over to... I was just looking around, and my eyes landed on the YA section, and I saw the cover of the sequel, which I actually have here because I've already borrowed it. I've already borrowed the sequel because it's that good, and I'm going to be devouring this book as well. But I saw the cover of... I saw this from far away, and I was like, that looks interesting. See this lovely architecture. It's a very interesting looking cover. I'm like, what is this about? So I read what this is about, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. But this is a sequel. Is the first book here, and that's how I read this book, the Shadow Cipher. York the Shadow Cipher takes place again in an alternate. I don't want to say history, because this is presumably present day. In an alternate version of New York City. In this alternate New York, there were a pair of twin architects in the 1700s, 1800s, whatever. Maybe late 1700s, early 1800s. A pair of twin architects who essentially like developed the New York landscape and the New York just a lot of technology that they developed that is so crucial in this alternate New York. And so you have these 3 protagonists, 2 of whom are also twins, male and female as well, and all 3 of them live in this historic apartment building that is, again, one of the buildings that these the twin architects created, and their house, their building is for sale or has been bought rather, and they're being evicted. And the architects, part of the whole thing with the architects is that they had left this big puzzle, this big cipher throughout the city, um, to be solved. So and that's also, that's a thing that a lot of people are on about in the story. But the twins were like, if we solve this cipher, maybe we could save our home. Maybe we don't have to move. Maybe we could get this building designated historic because for some reason it's already not. Fine, whatever. That's what essentially spurs the story, is the idea that they need to solve this book in order they need to solve this puzzle, this grand cipher, in order to not be evicted, in order to keep their home. And I don't want to give away too much, um, but it's a really wild ride, the whole book, because they're doing this, and then they learn, like always, there's always another mystery that's learned or unveiled. Um, but there's also like the implication, like you read it and it's like, oh, this is YA fantasy. It's just, oh, we're solving a puzzle. But then it's like, wait a minute, are we getting into like sci-fi fantasy here? It's like it's really interesting. I was born and raised in New York, and there was a show on, oh my gosh, what's it called? NYC TV. It was like one of the over the air channels. I think it was like 20 25 25 1, I think it was. It was a channel or something. NYC TV. There was a show called Secrets of New York. And the host is tall. I think she was like a former model. Took you around and you learn different parts. You learn about the history of different parts of New York City. And that's what a lot of this book reminded me of, because a lot of these things I didn't know. Why would I know about the former asylum on, I think it was Governor's Island or Roosevelt Island? Why would I? Why would I know about that? It was it was really interesting because, one, I was learning about the city. I enjoyed Secrets of New York a lot too, because obviously the city has a very varied history. It's a very large place. So if the whole book felt like that, not everything was, straight on par. But this being an alternate New York with an alternate history, there was also like a council of, I think it was called the Council of First Nations or something. I guess it was kind of like a UN representative of all of the First Nations and First Peoples in the U.S., and that was really interesting, and cool. It was a really good read. The characters were really well written. It's YA, but it wasn't, oh, a forced romance and we have 13-year-olds acting like corny 17-year-olds type of romance. It wasn't any of that, and I really appreciate that, because that is unnecessary most of the time. You had the female character, one of the twins. She has some type of, it's not really specified what it is, but she has maybe some type of like anxiety disorder, and she has her service animal for that, or her emotional support animal for that. And it's really cool, because it's just kind of like an as is. It's not like this big um deal to be made, or like haha pointed out anyway type of way. It's just, oh, she has this animal, you deal with it, and everyone deals with it and moves around their way. And I think there was something similar. There's kind of like something maybe similar happening with her brother, but it wasn't like ever super specified. And then also you had like a lot of diverse characters. Like almost every other character who was described physically was brown, and that was great, because it's not something that often happens, and it's more representative of New York. Because a lot of people are not just blue-eyed people for blue eyes and blonde hair. Because a lot of other YA books, oh, people are only noticeable or noted when they have blue eyes or green eyes or blonde hair, or like anything exotic is always like, oh, the thing to be described. But this was just, oh, he has lovely black hair, oh, he has lovely brown eyes, oh, he has locks, oh, she looks like this. It was just everyone. It was great. There was a lot of melanin in this book. I think it's supposed to be a trilogy. This was the first book of the trilogy. I have the second book, and the third book is coming out next year. So, if you're looking for like a puzzle adventure, I feel like it's kind of like in the way that a series of unfortunate events is uncovering like a secret. It's not necessarily even a secret society, but like big secrets about how the world works. This is that this is doing that, but then also like historical factoids, great character writing, diverse characters in many ways. So this is that book. So if you want to read that book, read York the Shadow Cipher. It's a 5-star book, in my opinion. I'm reading a lot of books right now, and I don't know that I'll do a library haul or a book haul or what I'm reading right now in another video. Um, but I don't know that I'll be reading too many books in November because I did a lot of my reading was spurred on by the my participation in Blogtober, and then I did the readathon and Dewey's readathon, and that just helped me finish a lot of these books. So, or not even finish a lot of these books. Actually, I don't think I finished any of the books. The reason, but I finished extra much as far as the books. But I'll link the blog posts for each book in the description of this video. So thanks for watching.